Hello, my dear wanderers. It's Soren. Welcome back. Tonight, we journey to a quiet, mist-covered England at the edge of one age and the dawn of another. The air is heavy with late summer warmth, the scent of damp fields and candle smoke drifting through narrow streets. Beneath the calm surface, there are quiet tensions, whispers of crowns and uncertain futures, of footsteps echoing in stone corridors, and somewhere beyond the sound of bells and distant waves, something unseen begins to stir. So before the silence of night surrounds you, take a moment to like and subscribe, just if this brought you peace of mind. Tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now dim the lights, take a deep breath, and let's drift into tonight's journey together. In the summer of 1485, England was already experiencing a certain level of tension. The War of the Roses, which had torn through the country for decades, was nearing its end, and the dynasty that would emerge from the chaos was still up for grabs. On one side there was Richard III, a king whose claim to the throne was shaky at best, and on the other, Henry Tudor, the man who would eventually become Henry VII, the first of the Tudor dynasty. Henry's claim to the throne was, in a sense, little more than a political maneuver, but it was backed by a coalition of supporters who saw him as the only hope to bring an end to the conflict. By the time Henry set foot on English soil with his small army, most of the country had settled into the rhythm of war. But as his troops marched towards the battlefield, something far more sinister was silently spreading across the land. Unnoticed by many, it wasn't the shadow of Richard III's army or the fear of an impending battle that loomed over Henry's journey. No, it was something much quieter and far more terrifying. It was an invisible, silent killer that moved from person to person without discrimination, and in a country still reeling from years of bloodshed. This invisible enemy would become one of the most feared diseases of the age. On the morning of August 22nd, 1485, Henry Tudor's army clashed with Richard III's forces at the Battle of Bosworth. It was a decisive moment in English history, with Richard's death marking the end of the Plantagenet dynasty and the beginning of the Tudor reign. Victory was Henry's, but it was bittersweet. For even as he placed the crown on his head and began the celebrations that would mark the start of his new reign, there was another, much darker force sweeping through the land. Barely 2 weeks after Henry's triumph, as he entered London and began the ceremonial rituals that would legitimize his rule, something else was taking root in the city. It wasn't the celebrations that mattered anymore. It was the disease which would later be known as the englishsweat, or pseudo-anglicus, began to spread through the population with a speed and ferocity that no one could comprehend. Unlike the infamous bubonic plague, which had swept across Europe in waves, this new illness was not an ancient scourge, nor was it something anyone had ever seen before. It arrived quickly, with little warning, and it killed just as fast. At first, the disease appeared innocuously enough. A few people in the crowded streets of London began to show signs of illness. It wasn't anything alarming, just a sudden chill, a headache, a slight fever. But within hours, the situation would escalate. The very same individuals who had felt the first symptoms began to sweat profusely, as if their bodies were rapidly overheating, only to succumb to the illness not long afterward. It was as if their bodies had gone into overdrive, and then, just as suddenly, had shut down. There was no time to prepare, no time for doctors to examine the symptoms and offer remedies. Instead, people were gripped by the panic that came with sudden death. This was not a slow illness that made its way through the body over days, weeks, or months. No, the English sweat, as it came to be known, worked much faster, from the first symptoms to death, could take as little as 24 hours, and for the unlucky few, it might be even quicker. A person could be perfectly healthy at midday and dead by nightfall, and yet it wasn't the speed of the disease that terrified people the most. It was the fact that there seemed to be no rhyme or reason to it. Young, old, rich, poor, none of it seemed to matter. Some of the wealthiest people in London, who should have been able to afford the best doctors and medicines, were among the first to fall. Meanwhile, others, the poor, who had no access to any kind of treatment, seemed to be spared. There was no pattern to the outbreak, no explanation for why some survived while others fell victim to the disease. As the disease swept through the city, it became clear that something far more complex was at work. There was no understanding of how it spread, why it took some and spared others, or what exactly it was. All that was known was that it was terrifyingly lethal and that it was moving through London with an alarming speed. Some physicians of the day, unable to offer any real solutions, resorted to the only treatments they knew: bleeding, purging, and prayers. But none of it worked. Over the following weeks, as the disease spread through the capital, the panic grew. Londoners, terrified of the invisible enemy that was taking lives so quickly, began to flee the city in droves. They carried the disease with them, spreading it to surrounding towns and villages. The death toll continued to rise, but the worst was yet to come. No one knew at the time, but this outbreak would only be the beginning. For the next several years, the English sweat would return again and again, haunting the land like a ghost, and no one could explain why. Historians have long debated the true nature of the disease. Some believe it was a form of influenza, while others suggest that it could have been a different viral or bacterial infection. But regardless of its origin, the disease's effects were undeniable. Its rapid onset, terrifying speed, and the inability of medical professionals to contain it left the people of England living in constant fear. With every summer, the possibility of the disease's return hung over them like a dark cloud. The true impact of the English sweat on Tudor society cannot be overstated. It was a disease that spared no one. The rich and the poor alike fell victim to its deadly grip, but more importantly, it was a disease that seemed to play no favorites. It didn't care about social status, wealth, or power. It was an equalizer, a reminder that no one was immune to the forces of nature. In a time when kings and queens, princes and princesses, and the wealthy could typically shield themselves from the most common plagues, the English sweat was a stark reminder that even the most powerful were not safe. The first major outbreak of the English sweat came just weeks after Henry VII's coronation, and it would not be the last. From 1485 through the early 1500s, it would return at unpredictable intervals, sweeping through towns and villages, taking the lives of many who were unlucky enough to fall ill. But despite its terrifyingly high mortality rate, the disease seemed to fade away almost as quickly as it had appeared, leaving behind only the memory of its devastation. It seemed to vanish for years, only to return again when people had begun to feel a little less fearful, and with each return, the terror it unleashed grew more palpable. As the English sweat continued to make its mysterious and terrifying appearances, one thing became clear: the disease was not just a fleeting problem. It was a constant shadow over the Tudor dynasty, one that hovered in the background of the political and social upheavals of the time. And while the royal family tried to stabilize the kingdom and build a new era of peace, the disease was doing what no rival king or rebellious noble could. It was slowly eroding the foundation of society itself. The second major outbreak of the English sweat occurred in 1508. more than 2 decades after Henry VII had claimed the throne. By this time, Henry VIII was already the reigning monarch, though he was just a young man, only 17 years old, when the disease began its terrible course. The royal court, a place of both diplomacy and excess, had become an ideal breeding ground for the deadly illness. Despite the wealth, the power, and the fine food, the court was far from sanitary. The elite lived in close quarters, surrounded by attendants, advisors, and courtiers, many of whom had no real understanding of hygiene or how diseases spread. It was in this setting that the disease once again made its entrance, though this time with a twist. It didn't just affect the poor or the working class. The English sweat had found its way into the heart of the aristocracy. At the time, it was believed that disease had a kind of social order. Plagues, after all, were thought to afflict the lower classes more than the nobles. But not this one, not the English sweat. The disease struck with a terrifying randomness. It targeted the healthy and strong, seemingly without any regard for social standing. It was the young, the vibrant, the well-fed, and the powerful who were falling prey to it. Young men, in the prime of their health and wealth, were among the first to be taken. The royal family, accustomed to security, could not escape the invisible hand of death that had descended upon England. Henry VIII himself, though largely spared from this particular outbreak, became deeply concerned. He watched as his courtiers fell one by one, their death sudden and brutal. It wasn't the kind of death that allowed for last rites or a peaceful passing in one's sleep. No, this was a death that came violently, quickly, and without warning. A mere chill would come over the victim, followed by a surge of feverish heat, and then, most disturbingly, a profuse and often foul-smelling sweat. It was as if the body was trying to expel something, some unseen poison, but in the process it drained itself of life. Henry's concern grew as he saw his friends and advisors fall, one by one. The court, once bustling with laughter, music, and pageantry, began to fall silent. The death toll mounted, and panic spread among the remaining courtiers. People fled London, hoping to outrun the invisible threat, but the disease moved with terrifying efficiency, traveling with them wherever they went. Whole households were infected in a matter of days, their members succumbing to the illness with no rhyme or reason. Some historians suggest that the terror was less about the deaths themselves and more about the fact that no one knew why it was happening or how to stop it. The doctors of the time, equipped with little more than rudimentary understanding of the human body, had no idea how to treat the illness. They relied on old practices, bloodletting, purging, and the administration of bizarre concoctions. But none of it worked. The sweating sickness seemed to laugh in the face of their feeble attempts at healing. The real terror of the disease, however, lay in its unpredictability. The nobles, who were used to seeing illness as something that could be controlled, found themselves powerless. No amount of wealth or privilege could keep the disease at bay. And as the disease spread further into the countryside, panic took hold across England. By 1517, the disease had come back again, and this time it was worse than ever. The epidemic was particularly severe in Oxford and Cambridge, where entire academic communities were wiped out. Scholars and students alike, in the prime of their youth, succumbed to the illness. The English sweat had become more than just a medical mystery. It was a cultural and political crisis. If the disease could strike down even the brightest minds of England, what hope did the rest of the population have? It seemed as though no one was safe, and yet there were still no answers. The disease came, it killed, and then it disappeared, vanishing as mysteriously as it had arrived. By the time of the 1528 outbreak, people had begun to think of the English sweat as a kind of curse. It was as if the disease had a mind of its own, returning at will, taking whom it pleased, and then retreating back into the shadows. The fear of the disease became a constant part of life, and with each outbreak, the panic grew. People began to wonder if it would ever end, or if they would live their lives constantly waiting for the next wave of death to arrive. As the years passed, the disease continued to pop up sporadically, always in the summer months when the weather was hot and humid. It became known as a seasonal affliction, one that would inevitably return as the heat rose. But even as it seemed to fade into the background of everyday life, it never really went away. The shadow of the English sweat hung over the country, an ever-present reminder that death could strike at any moment, no matter who you were or where you lived. The last major outbreak of the English sweat occurred in 1551, and by that time people had grown accustomed to its return. The court of Henry VIII, now under the rule of his son Edward VI, was still reeling from the long-lasting impact of the disease. It had taken so many of the brightest and best that the country had to offer, yet the cause of the disease remained as elusive as ever. Scientists and doctors were still unable to figure out what had caused the outbreak or why it had such a devastating impact on the health of England's elite. Even today, nearly 500 years later, historians and epidemiologists continue to debate the cause of the English sweat. Some believe it was an early form of the flu. Others suggest it could have been a type of hantavirus, a disease carried by rodents. Yet, despite all the theories, the true nature of the disease remains a mystery. What is certain, however, is that the English sweat had a profound impact on England, shaping not only the lives of its people, but also the very course of its history. As the English sweat continued to spread through the countryside and cities, its presence became an unavoidable fact of life. Its reputation as an equalizer, a force that spared no one, permeated every level of society. Those who were accustomed to the idea that wealth and status provided a shield against the common ills of the time found themselves face to face with the cruel reality that their titles, riches, and power meant nothing to this mysterious disease. It didn't care if you were royalty or a peasant, young or old. The English sweat seemed to pick and choose at random, often with no rhyme or reason. In some ways, the randomness of the disease was its most terrifying aspect. The plague that had ravaged Europe for centuries, bubonic plague or the Black Death, followed a more predictable pattern. It usually struck the poor first, those living in crowded, unsanitary conditions, with malnutrition making them more vulnerable to illness. But the English sweat ignored such distinctions. Instead, it seemed to have a particular fondness for the healthy and the strong. Young, robust men, often in the prime of their lives, fell ill and died just as easily as anyone else. There was no immunity from the disease, and yet the wealthy and powerful were often the first to be struck. For the courtiers and the elite, who lived in the tight-knit confines of royal palaces and city manors, the disease spread quickly. It made its way through the layers of servants and nobility alike, with no care for rank or station. It was as though the disease found its victims in a perfectly equalizing way, making it clear that no one, no matter their bloodline, was invincible. The nobles, used to having their health protected by lavish homes, the finest medical care, and access to the best food and drink, suddenly found themselves vulnerable to something far beyond their control. No amount of wealth could stop it. Those in the most privileged positions were struck down just as swiftly as those in the most modest. There was no rhyme or reason to why one person survived while another fell. And this sense of helplessness, this realization that the most powerful were not immune, added to the terror of the disease. At the court of Henry VIII, the disease seemed to take no pity on the king's closest allies. One of the most famous victims was Henry's own confidant, Sir William Compton. Compton was a man who had served the king loyally, holding the position of groom of the stool, which meant he was in charge of managing the king's personal affairs, an intimate and trusted role. And yet, this seemingly invincible figure, one of the king's closest companions, succumbed to the English sweat in a matter of hours. His death was a reminder that no one, not even the king's most trusted servants, could escape the grip of this invisible killer. The same fate befell other members of the royal circle. While Henry VIII himself was spared, his kingdom's most trusted figures continued to fall. The deaths were sudden and shocking, with no chance for proper farewells or final rites. Physicians, who often had little understanding of the diseases that ravaged the land, could do little more than offer comfort or prayers. The medical knowledge of the time was woefully inadequate for a disease that acted so quickly and unpredictably. The doctors of the day, still bound by outdated theories and ancient practices, could only stand by as the disease tore through the ranks of the aristocracy. Even after the disease subsided, it left behind a deep psychological scar on the people. The trauma of seeing so many well-fed, healthy young men taken so suddenly was a blow that would not be easily forgotten. It shattered the comforting notion that the privileged were somehow immune to the forces of nature. For the first time in a long while, the people of England were reminded of their own vulnerability, and the sudden death of so many influential figures only reinforced this feeling of helplessness. But what was even more disturbing was the pattern that began to emerge as the English sweat made its appearances over the following years. It didn't just strike with one massive wave and then fade into history, never to return. Instead, it seemed to operate on a cycle. Each time it appeared, it was slightly different, sometimes more deadly, sometimes less, but always terrifying in its unpredictability. It seemed to come and go without any explanation, leaving people wondering when the next outbreak would occur. The disease's periodic return only deepened the sense of dread among the population. People began to fear the summer months, when the disease seemed most likely to strike. The very air felt different in those days, as if it was pregnant with the possibility of illness. In fact, the fear of the disease became almost as pervasive as the disease itself. People began to speak of the pseudo-anglicus, the English sweat, as though it were a phantom, something that could appear without warning, strike down the unsuspecting, and then vanish just as quickly. For a time, it was as if no one was safe. Doctors, scientists, and even the clergy were at a loss to explain the disease, much less stop it. And though many people turned to religion in hopes of divine intervention, even that offered little solace. The disease was indifferent to their pleas. It swept through towns and cities, taking whom it pleased, and no prayers seemed to have any effect. As the centuries went on, the English sweat began to fade from living memory, but not before it left a lasting mark on English society. The mystery of the disease lingered in the minds of the people, a quiet reminder of the unpredictability of life and death. What made the disease even more unsettling was that it never really disappeared, though it stopped reappearing with the same intensity by the 1550s. It remained a shadow in the historical record, a disease that could strike with no warning and no reason, leaving behind only the memory of the panic it had caused. The mystery of the English sweat has never been fully solved. Today, historians and scientists continue to speculate on what it might have been. Some believe it was an early form of the flu, while others suggest it was a hantavirus, a disease transmitted by rodents. Still others think it may have been an unknown pathogen that simply died out over time, leaving no trace of itself behind. What is clear, however, is that the English sweat had a profound impact on Tudor England, leaving a legacy of fear, uncertainty, and a deep-seated awareness of the fragility of life. As the 16th century progressed, the outbreaks of the English sweat became less frequent, but their impact remained embedded in the collective consciousness of the nation. By the time of the reign of Queen Elizabeth I, the disease was more a spectre of the past, a terrifying ghost story whispered around dinner tables. The fear that had once gripped London and the rest of England slowly faded, but the mystery of its origins and sudden disappearances continued to perplex those who looked back on the terrifying years of its presence. Yet, for those who had lived through the outbreaks, the English sweat was not something easily forgotten. The memory of it lingered in the corners of the Tudor era, casting a shadow over the political, social, and cultural life of the time. The disease had claimed lives not just of commoners, but of some of the most powerful figures in the land. It had shaken the very foundation of English society, and its mysterious nature left a lingering sense of vulnerability that would haunt even the strongest of monarchs. Queen Elizabeth I, a monarch who was known for her strength, intellect, and poise, was not immune to the fear that the English sweat had instilled in the English public. Though the outbreaks were less frequent during her reign, the spectre of the disease still loomed large in the minds of those who had witnessed its devastating effects. Elizabeth's own court was no stranger to fear. While she was able to maintain control over her kingdom and her people, the sudden and unexpected deaths of nobles, courtiers, and close advisors still unsettled her. But the disease's legacy didn't just affect the lives of monarchs or nobles. It also seeped into the fabric of everyday life. In the years following the most intense outbreaks, a sense of paranoia gripped the population. People lived in fear of what they could not see, and the possibility of another wave of the disease became an ever-present threat. The very nature of the illness, its rapid onset, and its ability to strike down the healthy and strong, made it a constant point of anxiety for all classes of society. It was a reminder that despite the advances of civilization, death was still an unpredictable and often invisible force. The question that remained unanswered for centuries was, of course, the same question that had haunted those who lived through the outbreaks. What exactly had caused the English sweat? Despite the centuries that have passed since its last appearance, the disease remains a historical enigma, one of the great unsolved mysteries of the Tudor period. Modern scientists and historians have offered various theories. Some have suggested that it may have been an early form of influenza, given the similarities in symptoms, fever, chills, and a rapid onset of illness. Others have pointed to hantavirus, a disease transmitted by rodents, which could explain the sporadic and unpredictable nature of the outbreaks. Still, others propose that it could have been some kind of bacterial infection, a mutation of an existing pathogen that simply disappeared when conditions changed. But for all the research and speculation, the disease's true origins remain a mystery. What makes the English sweat particularly intriguing is that it appears to have disappeared as suddenly as it arrived, unlike the Black Death, which would continue to return in waves for centuries, or smallpox, which would continue to claim lives long after the Tudor period. The English sweat simply faded away. There were no more recorded outbreaks after the 1550s, and by the time of the English Civil War in the 17th century, the disease was little more than a distant memory, a chilling tale that had been passed down through generations. The lack of records after the mid-1500s suggests that either the disease ceased to exist, or it became so mild and sporadic that it no longer posed a significant threat to the population. This sudden disappearance has only deepened the mystery. Why did it stop? Was it the result of natural changes in the climate, the population's development of immunity, or perhaps some other environmental factor? Or was it simply that the conditions that had allowed the disease to thrive no longer existed? Interestingly, there were a few other diseases that came and went in a similar fashion, though none were as deadly or as fast-acting as the English sweat. The recurring question of why some diseases disappear while others persist remains one of the great questions in the study of epidemiology. In the case of the English sweat, it is possible that, like other mysterious diseases, it simply found itself outpaced by other illnesses, or perhaps its original pathogen mutated into a less lethal form. Over the centuries, historians and medical researchers have tried to solve the riddle of the English sweat, but with limited success. Without physical evidence such as preserved tissue or bacteria, it remains impossible to pinpoint the exact nature of the disease. The records of the time, written by those who were struck by it or who witnessed its effects, offer only partial glimpses of what it might have been like. The descriptions of the symptoms, fever, chills, the intense sweating, and the rapid progression of the illness, are chilling, but they offer little concrete information, and so the English sweat remains, for now, a ghost of history. It is an unsettling reminder that some of the most terrifying events in history leave behind no clear answers, no definitive explanations. We are left to piece together the fragments of the past, to make educated guesses based on the limited information available to us. Yet, for all the theories and hypotheses, we may never know the true cause of this terrifying disease that gripped England for nearly a century. Perhaps that is the greatest mystery of all, why some of history's most terrifying events leave no trace, no clue as to their origins, and simply vanish without a trace. It is as if they were never meant to be understood, only remembered, a warning to those who come after to beware the unseen forces that lurk in the shadows. The English sweat is one of those forces, and though it is no longer a threat to the modern world, its legacy continues to haunt the pages of history, a reminder that some questions are destined to remain unanswered. By the time the English sweat seemed to vanish from England's shores, its effect on the nation's psyche was far from over. The royal family, the aristocracy, and the clergy had all felt the cruel hand of this mysterious plague, and its presence had become a constant spectre in their lives. It didn't just take lives, it took away the comforting illusions of control, order, and safety that came with wealth and status. The disease had undermined the very fabric of society, reminding the powerful that no matter how much money, land, or privilege one held, they were still vulnerable to the forces of nature. The English sweat did not discriminate. It took anyone. The aristocracy, for example, who had long been accustomed to having the best physicians and access to whatever luxuries their money could afford, now found themselves as susceptible to this sickness as anyone. It didn't matter if you were a well-fed nobleman, a trusted royal advisor, or a servant. When the disease came, it took what it wanted, and it often took the strongest and healthiest first. And this terrifying realization that no amount of gold, no political title, no social standing could shield one from the disease, had a profound effect on the psychology of the elite. In the courts of the Tudors, where dynastic intrigues and power struggles were already rampant, the presence of the English sweat added a new layer of anxiety. The disease didn't just kill, it created a palpable sense of dread that lingered long after the most intense outbreaks had passed. The very air in England seemed to be filled with a silent terror, and people walked around as though death might suddenly appear at their doorsteps. It was not a slow disease that crept up over weeks or months, allowing time for reflection and preparation. It was sudden, a lightning strike of death, making its victims feel as if they had no control over their own fates. At the heart of this fear was the very uncertainty of the disease itself. There were no patterns, no clues to suggest who would be struck down next. In this way, the English sweat was a psychological warfare that stretched far beyond its actual physical toll. The idea that you could go to bed healthy one night and never wake up the next day became a terrifying reality for the people of England. Nobles were not safe, and neither were their families. The disease didn't care if you were a prince or a peasant. It just took what it could, and that unpredictability added to the paranoia. People became afraid of each other. A simple cough, a sneeze, a fever could send people into a panic, fearing that the disease might be lurking. The English sweat created an environment where everyone became a potential carrier of death, whether they knew it or not. The disease seemed to spread with a kind of calculated speed, and once it arrived in a community, it seemed to pick off victims in rapid succession. If it struck someone near you, it might only be a matter of time before it reached you. The royal family, too, was affected by this atmosphere of dread. The thought that the monarch, whose very bloodline was the symbol of continuity, was not immune to such a mysterious death was deeply unsettling. In fact, the very foundation of the Tudor monarchy, which had been built upon the victorious rise of Henry VII, seemed to be tested by the disease's persistence. Henry's reign had begun with such promise, with the end of the Wars of the Roses and the establishment of a new dynasty, but now it was threatened by something far more insidious than foreign enemies or political rivals. It was threatened by an invisible foe, one that could bring down even the strongest king. The psychological effect on Henry VII was noticeable. Though he survived the early outbreaks of the disease, he saw his trusted servants, soldiers, and courtiers die suddenly. Henry's concern for his own health, coupled with his desire to ensure the stability of his newly established dynasty, made him particularly paranoid. The royal court became a place where health was not just about avoiding the common cold. It was about staying alive in a world where no one knew what could kill you next. When Henry VIII ascended to the throne, he brought with him a very different energy. His youthful vigor and enthusiasm were a sharp contrast to his father's cautious, paranoid approach to governance. But even Henry VIII, known for his boisterous nature and larger-than-life presence, could not escape the terror of the English sweat. Though he survived the outbreaks of the disease during his early reign, many of his close friends did not. As the disease made its way through the royal court, it left a trail of death, especially among those who were the king's most trusted advisors. Perhaps the most notable of these was Sir William Compton, Henry's close companion and one of his most trusted confidants. Compton's death from the English sweat, though not unique, was symbolic. He had been with Henry since the king's youth, a man who had helped guide the new monarch into power. His sudden death was a reminder to the king that no matter how close one was to the throne, no matter how loyal, the disease could take anyone in a matter of hours. For a king like Henry, who was accustomed to being the most powerful figure in the realm, it was a harsh reminder that he too was vulnerable to forces beyond his control. But it wasn't just the death of close companions that shook Henry VIII. It was the effect that the disease had on his kingdom. The English sweat caused a kind of collective trauma. Its unpredictability and rapid spread forced people to live in constant fear. Those who had once relied on their health, their strength, and their position in society now realized that those things could be stripped away in an instant. Death, once something that felt like a distant eventuality, was suddenly right at the doorstep, knocking. As Henry VIII's reign continued, the court became more and more concerned with avoiding the disease. And though the englishsweat would eventually fade from public view, it had changed the royal court forever. No longer could anyone truly feel secure in the knowledge that their place in society or their proximity to power would protect them from death. The disease had proven that no one, not even kings, were beyond its reach. In the years that followed, the englishsweat's legacy would endure. The fear of its return lingered, and it would continue to shape the way people thought about illness, power, and their own mortality. And though the disease itself faded into obscurity, the psychological scars it left behind remained. The englishsweat wasn't just a disease. It was a reminder that death could come at any time to anyone, and that the most powerful among us were just as vulnerable as the most ordinary. By the time we reached the reign of Queen Elizabeth I, the englishsweat had long since faded from the forefront of public consciousness, replaced by the more pressing concerns of international diplomacy, the religious conflicts of the Reformation, and, of course, the ongoing concerns of English imperial ambitions. And yet, for all its outward progress, England was still haunted by the spectre of this mysterious disease that had claimed so many lives in such an unpredictable, terrifying manner. Though the disease had seemingly vanished by the mid-16th century, the mental and emotional scars it left on the English people were slow to heal. For the generations who had witnessed its arrival, its sudden devastation, and the complete inability of the medical world to explain it, the very idea of disease was forever changed. In a world where death often seemed to follow a clear course, a slow, predictable march to the grave, the englishsweat had been a reminder that life could be snatched away in an instant, without warning from even the most unlikely of victims. And so, as Elizabeth's court turned its attention to matters of religion, the arts, and politics, the memory of the disease quietly lingered in the back of people's minds, like an echo from another era. Though it no longer made its deadly return, there was always that nagging thought: what if it came back? The fear of sudden death became a kind of quiet backdrop to everyday life. In the Tudor period, a lingering uncertainty that people tried to ignore, but could never quite escape. Even the elite, who had once believed that their wealth, their titles, and their influence could shield them from such threats, were forever altered by the legacy of the englishsweat. For all their pomp and circumstance, for all the grand feasts and elaborate pageantry of their lives, the nobility had been reminded of the one thing that no amount of money or power could protect them from: the capricious nature of death. The very idea of being in control of your health, your destiny, your future, seemed a little less certain after the sweat had taken its toll. Historians have noted that the fear of the disease, though not always at the forefront, remained a subtle undercurrent in England. For generations, the way people spoke of illness, the way they dealt with death, even the way they regarded the body, all seemed to be forever affected by this strange, elusive plague that had swept through their lives. It was no longer just about sickness. It was about the suddenness of it, the way it could arrive with no warning and take away even the most vital and healthy people in the blink of an eye. In fact, some historians suggest that the fear of the englishsweat indirectly contributed to the growing interest in medical science and the development of more modern approaches to healthcare in England. The urgency to understand diseases, to recognize symptoms, and to develop effective treatments became more pronounced after the englishsweat, as people struggled to regain some sense of control over their health. After all, if a disease could strike so suddenly, so mercilessly, surely understanding it could help avoid its return, or at least prepare for it, should it come again. The outbreak of the englishsweat also coincided with the rise of new theories in medicine, particularly in relation to the body's humors and the miasma theory of disease, which posited that illness was caused by bad air or foul smells. While these theories were primitive by modern standards, they represented an attempt to make sense of a world that had been thrown into disarray by a disease that seemed to operate without any logic. Of course, many of these theories were based on superstition or outdated practices, but they represented a broader shift toward an era in which people sought to find rational explanations for what had previously been viewed as divine punishment or fate. The English sweat was also, in its own way, a precursor to the fear that would arise in later epidemics, such as the bubonic plague and influenza outbreaks. It was, perhaps, a dress rehearsal for the pandemics that would eventually sweep across Europe in later centuries. The patterns of panic, the social isolation, the sudden loss of life, all of these elements became ingrained in the collective memory of England and other parts of Europe, creating a historical blueprint for how societies would respond to future health crises. In the wake of the English sweat, England began to develop more formal systems for handling epidemics, including quarantine measures, the establishment of pest houses, and more structured public health responses. While these systems were rudimentary and often ineffective, they represented a nascent understanding of disease control. The authorities began to recognize the need for more organized efforts to combat outbreaks, particularly as the awareness of contagious diseases grew. Despite all of this, however, the English sweat remained an enigma. It was a disease that defied explanation, that took lives without warning or reason, and that left no clear answer as to why it had appeared or why it had disappeared. And yet, even as it faded from the public eye, the memory of it lingered, like a shadow in the minds of those who had lived through it. The impact of the English sweat, however, was not limited to the world of medicine or public health. It also had a lasting effect on the social and political landscape of England. The disease had left its mark on the Tudor dynasty, particularly during the early years of Henry VII's reign. The sudden and tragic deaths of key figures in his court had thrown the monarchy into disarray, and the uncertainty surrounding the disease had only added to the stress and instability of the early Tudor years. Even after the disease had passed, the Tudors could never fully escape the legacy of the English sweat. It was, after all, a reminder that nothing was certain. The fear that had gripped the nation, that had forced people to look at death in a new way, had become an integral part of the Tudor psyche. The Tudors, as a family and a dynasty, would never be able to escape the knowledge that life was fragile and that even the most powerful figures in the land were subject to the whims of fate. As we look back on the history of the English sweat, we can only wonder at the mystery of it all. Why did it appear? Why did it strike when it did? And why did it fade away so suddenly? The answers may never be clear, but one thing is certain: the legacy of the English sweat remains as part of the great tragic tapestry of England's past, a reminder that no one, no matter how mighty, is immune to the forces of nature, and that death, unpredictable and merciless, is always just around the corner. As the centuries passed and the English sweat faded further into history, it began to take on the status of a legend, a ghost story told by the fireside, a dark chapter that, while never fully forgotten, became increasingly distant from the minds of those who had never experienced it firsthand. The lack of definitive answers only helped solidify the disease's place in the realm of the mysterious. In a way, the uncertainty surrounding it added to its mystique. After all, we tend to fear what we cannot understand, and the English sweat had become, in its own way, a symbol of that fear. Historians have debated the true nature of the disease for centuries, with few answers. But it wasn't just the scientific and medical communities who pondered over the question of what caused the disease. The English sweat also found its way into literature, culture, and folklore, as writers and storytellers tried to make sense of something that didn't make sense. To the people of the Tudor era, it seemed as though this plague had appeared out of nowhere, struck down the strong and the healthy, and then vanished without a trace. It was the perfect recipe for a mystery, a disease that defied all expectations, that had no clear origin, no predictable pattern, and no obvious cure. And as with all unsolved mysteries, it became a symbol for the larger, more universal question of human mortality. How much control do we truly have over our lives when death can come for anyone, at any time with no warning? The answer, it seemed, was very little. The disease's apparent lack of consistency only added to its terror. While some epidemics followed predictable patterns, like the bubonic plague which spread through rats and fleas, the English sweat behaved in a way that baffled everyone. It struck swiftly, with an almost predatory efficiency. Victims could go to bed feeling perfectly fine, only to be dead within a matter of hours. The suddenness, the rapid progression, and the lack of visible signs of infection made it terrifying. The people didn't know if they could catch it, from breathing the same air as someone who was ill, or from touching the wrong object, or from simply being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Adding to the difficulty in understanding the disease was the fact that the symptoms varied greatly from one case to the next. In some cases, it began with a sudden, violent chill, followed by an intense fever and a deluge of sweat. In others, the sweating came first, a drenching perspiration that seemed to soak the body through. But what was universally described, regardless of the individual symptoms, was the speed with which it moved through its victim. The bodies drained of energy by the sweat and fever often succumbed to death so quickly that there was little time to mourn before the next person in line was struck down. What made the disease even more baffling was that it didn't follow any clear social or medical order. The wealthiest and most powerful were often the first to fall, and the disease had a strange predilection for young, healthy men, an age group that might have been considered the least likely to succumb to such a disease. This, of course, only increased the panic among the nobility. If they, who had access to the best medical care, were not immune, then who was? It didn't help that the best doctors of the time had no answers. The prevailing medical theories were still rooted in antiquated ideas of the humors, the bodily fluids thought to control health, bloodletting, purges, and other such treatments, though now seen as ineffective and often dangerous, were still the go-to solutions for many physicians. In the face of the English sweat, they were powerless to do anything but watch as the disease tore through its victims. The very tools that had worked for centuries against other ailments, methods that had given doctors a sense of control over the human body, were of no use here. The sweat was different. The disease seemed to have no natural order, no predictable course, and no room for the remedies of the time. This, in turn, created a sense of helplessness among both the medical community and the general population. The royal court, accustomed to control, suddenly found itself confronted with a force it couldn't manage. Even Henry VIII, the boisterous and powerful monarch, could do little but watch as his closest companions fell ill, sometimes dying before they could even reach a physician's care. The disease had no regard for social class or influence, and as a result, it rattled the monarchy and the ruling class to their very core. But as time passed, the English sweat began to fade, both from public memory and from the annals of medical history. It was not as persistent as the Black Death, which left its imprint on Europe for centuries, nor as widespread as smallpox, which would go on to kill millions. Instead, the English sweat was a brief but intense horror that would appear in waves and then disappear. Historians have suggested various causes for this disappearing act. Some believe that the disease was a mutation of another pathogen, one that could no longer sustain itself after a certain point. Others suggest that the English population developed a form of herd immunity after successive outbreaks, which reduced the disease's ability to spread. Or perhaps, as some have speculated, the very nature of the disease was tied to specific environmental factors, climate, perhaps, or other ecological changes that gradually ceased to exist. For all the questions left unanswered, one thing is certain: the English sweat remains one of the most elusive, frightening, and puzzling diseases in history. It was a reminder to the people of the time that, despite their advances in medicine, despite their wealth and power, there were forces beyond their understanding and control. As for the future of disease in England, the English sweat's legacy continued to inform public health and medical thinking, though it would be many more centuries before germ theory was fully developed. The fear of the unknown that the sweat instilled in the public never truly disappeared. The people of Tudor England had faced an enemy they couldn't see, an enemy that came without warning and left without explanation. This would shape the way the English and later the world would view disease for centuries to come. By the end of the Tudor era, the English sweat had all but vanished from the public eye, with no more major outbreaks recorded, and its terrifying impact fading into the past. The disease was slowly relegated to the realm of historical curiosity. Yet, for all its disappearance from daily life, the shadow of the English sweat lingered in the corners of English history. It wasn't just a plague. It was a symbol, an emblem of the fragility of human life, of the way illness could strike without warning, making a mockery of wealth, power, status. It was a reminder that no one, not even the king, was safe from the randomness of fate. Historians would continue to search for clues, trying to solve the mystery of the disease's origins and why it vanished so suddenly. But the answers remained elusive, as if the very nature of the disease defied explanation. The lack of conclusive evidence, the absence of physical remains or preserved samples, meant that any theories about the English sweat remained speculative, mere educated guesses, without a way to pinpoint the pathogen responsible. All that remained were stories, accounts from those who had lived through the terror, and the unsettling sense that something truly strange had taken place. And then, in the 20th century, the English sweat was suddenly thrust back into the public consciousness, though not as an active threat. Instead, it became the subject of renewed interest among researchers and historians, who sought to understand it through the lens of modern science. Theories were proposed, each one trying to connect the symptoms and historical accounts to a known disease. Some suggested that the sweat was an early form of influenza, an ancestor of the seasonal flu that still haunts the world today. Others speculated that it could have been a hantavirus, a disease transmitted by rodents, which could explain its sporadic nature and the way it seemed to strike certain populations more than others. But while these theories offered plausible explanations, they didn't solve the mystery completely. After all, the English sweat had disappeared so abruptly and without a trace, making it difficult to understand why it had been so virulent in the first place. If it was influenza, why had it been so deadly in some years, and almost non-existent in others? And if it was a hantavirus, why did it seem to prefer certain individuals, young, healthy men in particular, while sparing others? These questions remained unanswered, and perhaps they always would, as the 21st century brought with it advances in molecular biology. Some scientists even began to entertain the possibility that the English sweat was caused by a pathogen that no longer existed. This idea, though speculative, suggested that the disease was the result of an ancient virus or bacterium that had mutated or evolved in a way that made it highly deadly, but that it had died out as conditions changed. Perhaps the rodent population that had once spread it had been wiped out or forced to evolve. Perhaps the environmental factors that had allowed the disease to thrive had changed, making the conditions for its spread untenable. In this way, the English sweat could be seen as a victim of its own success, an extraordinarily deadly disease that had simply run out of hosts. This theory, while fascinating, does little to answer the fundamental question: why did the disease disappear so suddenly, and why did it affect certain people in such a seemingly random fashion? Theories abound, but the truth remains as elusive as it was centuries ago. What is certain is that the English sweat was a moment in history that was as profound as it was mysterious. In the end, the legacy of the English sweat is not just in the lives it claimed or the suffering it caused. It lies in the way it reshaped the collective consciousness of England. It was an invisible enemy that struck without warning, leaving in its wake a deep sense of vulnerability that would not be easily erased. The fear it inspired in the nobility and the common people alike was a lasting reminder of the fragility of life. It did not matter how powerful or wealthy you were. The English sweat cared for none of that. All it took was one sudden chill, one drop of sweat, and your life could be changed forever. For the royal family in particular, the English sweat is a harrowing reminder that no matter how much control they had over the kingdom, they could never control death. Henry VIII, a king who was larger than life in so many ways, was humbled by the rapid death of his close companions. Sir William Compton's sudden demise was but one of many examples of how the disease mocked the very idea of royal invincibility. For a monarch like Henry, who had spent so much of his reign consolidating power and asserting his dominance, the English sweat was a cruel reminder that his rule was still subject to forces beyond his control. And yet, despite the fear and the unpredictability of the disease, life in Tudor England continued. The courts of Henry VIII and Elizabeth I would go on to experience political intrigue, courtly love, and the elaborate spectacle of royal pageantry, but in the background there remained the quiet, lingering knowledge that disease was never far away. Even in the most extravagant palaces and grandest halls, there was always the possibility of sudden death. In a way, the English sweat had become an unwelcome companion in the court of Tudor England. It was a reminder that even the most elegant and well-ordered society could be upended by something as simple, as untraceable, as a sudden illness. Whether it was a mysterious virus, an ancient form of influenza, or something else entirely, the disease had left a permanent mark on England. It had shaken the foundation of English society, reminding everyone that in the end, there were no guarantees, no assurances, and no certainty in life. The English sweat may have disappeared from the historical record, but its legacy lives on. It remains one of the great unsolved mysteries of the Tudor period, a story that will never be fully understood, but which will always be remembered. The disease that swept through the courts, that brought down the strong and spared the weak, is still a ghost that haunts the pages of history. In a world where we think we can control so much, it is a reminder that there are still forces beyond our understanding, and in that mystery there is both fear and fascination.